Hey legal team, welcome once again to Fitz in Law School. It has been a while, and so I might have to remind you. I'm Fitz, and today we are going to be talking about pretty general stuff. I mean, not going too crazy. So, let's go through the most basic stuff right now. Okay, so right now, I'm taking 5 classes. So the first one I'm taking is administrative law. And so essentially what that is that's learning about how courts deal with various like government agencies. And so a huge amount of things that are happening in the world, or not in the world, that are happening in the country are actually based on administrative laws and rules as opposed to actual hard laws by Congress. And so that means that because all the executive agencies are making various types of rules that also affects drastically huge amounts of what we do every single day, that means that sometimes people go and they sue over those rules, whether it's like the rule doesn't make any sense, or it wasn't made properly, or the procedures that were followed within the agency, they don't fit how they should actually have been followed. There are lots of different reasons why you can go and you can sue an agency for the rules that they making or aren't making. The next one is professional responsibility. So as far as I know, every single law school has kind of a general requirement that you take kind of an ethics class or a professional responsibility class, and you have, and a lot of times you have options about one or the other. And then after that, you're supposed to take the MPRE, that's the Multi-State Professional Responsibility Exam. I believe that's what it is. But essentially, it's a big multiple choice exam. So yeah, so that's a pretty straightforward class, but there is lots of like really interesting reading. And essentially, what you do is there are rules to like ethics rules that all lawyers obviously have to abide by. And so what we do is we go and we read about situations, and then we talk about the rules that apply, and then we just kind of explore those rules. It's a really, really kind of, it's a talking class. It's kind of an exploratory class as opposed to, these are the hard rules, and that's the way it is. And no, it's just a really, really interesting class. Next, we have con law, and that's constitutional law, and that's constitutional law 1. A lot of people are familiar with the ideas of what con law should be. Not necessarily what it is, but what it should be. When someone like people, scream all the time, it's about the First Amendment and stuff. Like, I have the right to say whatever the hell I want, whenever I want. That's not true. But it's interesting to hear something that's, like when people go and get in arguments, they don't usually argue about the Clean Air Act or of 1970. Like they don't really argue about that. What they do often argue about is the ideals that are kind of inscribed within the Constitution. And so because of that, it's interesting to put a little bit more factual meat on the bones, because everyone kind of knows the ideals that are said in the Constitution. They don't really know what's said in the Constitution. And then they only know a couple of the buzz things, like they know freedom of speech, or they just say First Amendment, and they, obviously most people know the Second Amendment as well. So it's very, very interesting. And then on top of that, we're dealing with cases that are obviously very important and have historical precedent. And I'm learning a lot about John Marshall. I'm actually reading a book on John Marshall that was written by the professor that I'm taking right now. And that's pretty great and pretty fun. But then also my particular professor, he likes going over like the history of the case before we get into the case. I love that. I think that's a great way to not only get people interested in the case, but also gives you way more context about why someone is fighting for what they're fighting for. I think that's really, really interesting. So yeah, so really, really loving that class as well, and the teacher is fantastic. Third, I'm taking evidence. Evidence also have a fantastic teacher in there, because my professor just does a really good job of explaining things, because evidence is not as simple as you would kind of think. There are lots of things that seem to be like kind of a winning thing within your argument when you're presenting a case that aren't actually allowed to be introduced into evidence, And then the other thing is that my lawyer mentor over the summer, I asked him, he also went to Hastings, and I said, hey, maybe specific to Hastings or in law school in general, what's one thing that you really wish you would have focused on or really wish you would have like kind of focused more on, or what would you want to get more out of within law school. And he said, and surprised, he said evidence. He said evidence touches a lot more things than you think it touches. So really, really pay attention to that. So I've definitely taken that to heart, and I'm really paying attention to that. And I can totally see how those things could be very, very applicable to lots of different situations. So super interesting thing. Yeah, so my 5th class is app-ad. And so by app-ad, I mean appellate advocacy. This semester, appellate advocacy is not something that everyone has to take, but it's something that I took because it's required if you go and you try out for moot court. So yeah. So, and it's essentially just, it's LRW, I've been saying it's LRW 3.0, which I actually wasn't expecting. I was not expecting it to just be LRW 3.0, which essentially what I mean by that is that it's just like LRW 2. So we're dealing with one situation the entire time, and you write a brief, and then the next half of the semester, you work on your oral argument. I didn't know that was going to be the case. I'm not sure what I expected. I thought that because it coupled with moot court, it was going to be something that was a little bit more like kind of in a support role with moot court. But it's I mean, I guess you could kind of say it is because you work on your briefing skills and then you work on your oral advocacy skills. And so in general, yeah, you need those things for moot court. I just thought that it was going to be much more directly involved with moot court. But that being said, it's a really, really interesting topic. And so, yeah, so I don't know, and I like my class. Again, it's a small class, which is kind of cool. And so, yeah, just super fun and super interesting. And yeah, we're dealing with an interesting case, which I will get to in a second. And then I want to talk about the extra things that I'm doing. The extra things that I'm doing, not required, but things I kind of chose to do. The first one was I ran for student government for one of the 2L reps, and I won. And hooray. And so that means I'm part of the student government here at Hastings. And so that is, again, it's not an enormous time commitment or anything like that, but it is something else that I'm doing. And it's not zero time commitment. And I'm also, I joined the finance committee and all that stuff. And so it's kind of cool to see the inner workings of that, but it's also just, more responsibility. And then the last thing is I joined moot court. This is something that actually is quite a bit of a time dedication, and it's going to be more so as we get closer to our competition. However, I'm going to Chicago in November, and so it just kind of moves up the timeline. And our full brief for our issue is due in 3 weeks, I think. Yeah, I think 3 weeks. It's mid-September right now, so I think like the first week in October or something like that. So that'll be really, really fun. And then after that, the actual competition where me and my 2 teammates, we go to Chicago. That is in mid-November. That's like the first or second week in November. So that should be super fun. Yeah. And so now let's kind of talk about the briefs. They're like for both of these briefs, one for app-ad and one for moot court, I'm doing, there are 2 issues in each one of those briefs, and then I'm assigned to one of them. And so for the first one, app-ad, they have 2 issues, and I'm doing essentially what's called the good faith exception for introducing evidence to a case. And so essentially what that is like, depending on the circumstances of how the police in this case went and got evidence to present to the case. Again, evidence, huh? Sometimes that can be introduced and sometimes it can't be introduced. But when it can't be introduced, sometimes there's an exception to that can't. And that's called the good faith evidence rule. And so, or good faith exception, that's what it's called. So I'm kind of working on whether or not that applies in this situation. And I'm essentially arguing, I'm representing the state, kind of unfortunately, but I'm representing the state and saying the good faith evidence rule exception should apply in this case. And and so that's just kind of an interesting argument because I don't agree with it personally, but I have to argue it, And so that's lawyers are going to do that all the time. So that's kind of an interesting thing. The second one for my moot court, and this is one I'm actually going to be arguing at a competition and all that stuff, which is going to be super fun. This deals with 2 things. It deals with the jurisdiction question and then also deals with the defamation question. And essentially, what's the standard for judging whether or not someone should be able to hold someone liable for defamation? And so I'm just arguing for a slightly less arduous legal standard that a particular person should be held to in our case, essentially, and in cases that are similar to our case. So yeah. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm working on this semester. And a lot of fun stuff, a lot of cool stuff. And then I just want to kind of bring it back around to 2L in general and just kind of talk about some kind of general thoughts that I'm having. And I don't know, it's kind of cool. But yeah, so that's just kind of my general situation right now with my first semester of my 2L year. I also, and I think it's going to be great. It's fantastic. And so, yeah, so next time I'm going to get into my briefs. All right. And so I think that I'm going to try and do it next week. Okay. That's my goal, is to do it next week. Because the briefs will definitely be really fresh. My appellate advocacy brief is actually due in full. Like, we did kind of a really rough draft, this week. Yesterday it was all turned in, and so then next Monday is going to be the full entire finalized draft. So got some work to do, but yeah, I think that's all right. Have a great week, everyone. It's a beautiful day in San Francisco, and I hope everyone has a great week. All right, see ya.
So you can